The dust cloud appeared first, a faint smudge against the hard blue canvas of the Wyoming sky. Clayton Reeves watched it from the porch of a house too large for one man, his knuckles white on the railing. For 6 months he had waited for this day. 6 months since he'd finally broken. Admitting the silence of the valley was no longer a bomb but a weight pressing the air from his lungs. He'd penned the letter to the agency in St. Louis, his words stiff and practical. He was a rancher, solvent, with a good spread and a solid house. He sought a wife, partner, a quiet presence to fill the echo in the empty rooms. Her name was to be L. Harper. The letters he'd received in return were as practical as his own. Her handwriting neat, her sentences economical. She was a woman of good character, willing to trade the city for the frontier. She would arrive on the Tuesday stage. Today. As the wagon drew closer, the dust resolved into the shape of a worn-out buckboard, not the sturdy stagecoach he'd expected. His brow furrowed. The driver, a weathered man named Silas who ran freight from Cheyenne, pulled the horses to a stop. Clayton's eyes scanned the wagon bed, searching for the solitary figure of his intended. He found none. Instead, a woman sat on the bench next to Silas, her back ramrod straight. And behind her, clustered amongst meager belongings, were children. Not 1 or 2, 5. His world, already balanced on a precarious axis of hope and dread, tilted sideways. This was wrong. A mistake. A catastrophic, 5-headed mistake. The woman climbed down, her movements weary but dignified. Her dress was clean but faded, telling stories of hardship in its frayed cuffs and meticulously patched seams. She was younger than he'd pictured, with exhaustion etched around eyes the color of a stormy sky. She gathered the children, a flock of small, silent figures who huddled close to her skirts. The oldest, a boy of about 10, stood slightly in front, his shoulders squared in a miniature imitation of a man's protective stance. "Mr. Reeves?" the woman asked. Her voice was low and steady, betraying none of the chaos he felt roiling inside him. Clayton could only nod, his throat tight. "I am Lillian Harper," she said, and the name was a blow.
El Harper.
It was her. But this was not the arrangement. "There's been a misunderstanding," he managed, the words tasting like rust. The agreement was for one. A tremor she tried to suppress ran through her hand as she clutched the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "The correspondence. It said you understood my situation." "Your situation?" Clayton's gaze swept over the 5 small, upturned faces watching him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "No, ma'am. My understanding was that you were alone." She reached into a worn reticule and produced a small packet of letters, tied with a string. His letters, and hers. He recognized the script. He took them, his fingers feeling numb as he scanned the pages. It was all there, the practical arrangements, the terse descriptions of his life and her willingness to join it. But there was no mention of children. Not a single word. He looked at the final letter of agreement, the one sent by the agency. At the bottom, next to her signature, was a note in faint pencil, almost an afterthought. "Arriving with my 5 children." He'd missed it. In his eagerness, in his desperate focus on the signature itself, he had completely overlooked the most critical sentence on the page. I didn't see this," he stammered, the paper trembling in his hand. He felt a fool, a blind, desperate fool. Lillian Harper's chin lifted. There was no plea in her eyes, only a profound, devastating weariness. "I see. Then we are at an impasse, Mr. Reeves. I sold everything we owned to afford the passage. We have nowhere else to go." The silence that followed was broken only by the sigh of the wind through the cottonwoods. Clayton looked from her proud, desperate face to the 5 pairs of eyes fixed on him. They were not an abstract concept. They were real, breathing, and utterly dependent. He had built this ranch as a penance, a place to serve out his sentence of solitude. He had invited a woman to share his quiet misery, not to fill his home with the chaos of a family. Yet here they were, a widow and her brood, delivered to his doorstep by his own careless mistake. The sun beat down, and in that moment, Clayton Reeves, a man haunted by a family he'd lost for another, was confronted with a family he never asked for. His carefully constructed world of guilt and isolation was about to be torn apart. He let out a long, slow breath, the air burning his lungs. "The sun's high," he said, his voice rough. "You can't stay out here. Bring your things inside. For tonight." It wasn't a welcome, and they both knew it. It was a stay of execution. Lillian nodded, a flicker of relief so faint it was almost imperceptible. She turned to her children. "Thomas, help me with the trunk." The boy nodded grimly, his young face set with a seriousness that didn't belong on a child. Clayton watched them, a knot tightening in his gut. He had wanted to cure his loneliness, but this felt like drowning in the needs of others. He led them into the house he had built with his own 2 hands, each plank and nail a monument to his guilt. The door opened into a large main room, clean and sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and black. The furniture was sturdy, functional, and lonely. As the family stepped inside, the house seemed to shrink and change. The silent rooms were suddenly filled with the soft scuff of small shoes, the rustle of worn fabric, the almost inaudible sound of breathing. It was an invasion. Clayton stood stiffly by the door as Lillian directed her children. Thomas, the eldest, set down a heavy, battered trunk. Next to him stood a girl, maybe 8, named Sarah, clutching a rag doll with the same fierce protectiveness her mother showed them. Then came the twins, Caleb and Joshua, identical 6-year-olds with wide, watchful eyes, and finally little Emily, who couldn't be more than 4, her thumb planted firmly in her mouth as she peeked at Clayton from behind her mother's skirt. "They won't be any trouble, Mr. Reeves," Lillian said, her voice quiet but firm, as if sensing his internal recoil. "They know how to behave." Clayton just grunted in response, unable to form a proper sentence. He felt trapped. Sending them away was impossible. They had no money, no kin in this territory. The nearest town was 2 days' ride. Letting them stay felt equally impossible. His life was a carefully balanced routine of hard work and quiet brooding, a penance he felt he deserved. Children were noise, chaos, life. They were everything his existence was not. "There are 2 rooms upstairs," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the staircase. "You can take those. I'll sleep down here." Lillian nodded her thanks and herded her children up the stairs. The floorboards above creaked under their weight. Clayton walked to the kitchen, a space he used for little more than brewing coffee and frying bacon. It was built for a family with a large pantry and a long table. He'd built it all remembering another kitchen, another family, a memory that was a constant, sharp-edged stone in his soul. He leaned against the counter, the silence from upstairs somehow louder than the previous emptiness. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble rasping against his calloused palm. What had he done? He had sought a simple solution, a quiet companion to ease the edges of his solitude. He had received a complication of immense proportions. Later, as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains, Lillian came downstairs. She had changed into a simpler, cleaner dress and had her hair tied back. She looked less like a weary traveler and more like a woman ready to take on the world, even if her resources were slim. "Mr. Reeves," she began, stopping a respectful distance away. "I know this is not what you intended. I will not be a burden. I am a hard worker. I can cook, clean, mend, tend a garden. The children, too. Thomas is strong, and Sarah is a great help. We will earn our keep until we can make other arrangements." Her pragmatism was disarming. He had expected tears, pleas. Instead, she offered labor. It was a transaction, and that was a language Clayton understood far better than emotion. "There's food in the pantry," he said, his tone still gruff. "Flour, beans, salted pork. Help yourself." She gave a small, grateful nod and moved toward the pantry. He watched her for a moment, her movements efficient and purposeful. She wasn't helpless. She was a survivor. He turned to leave the room, to retreat to the porch and the familiar comfort of the vast, empty landscape. "Mr. Reeves." He stopped, his back to her. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight he hadn't anticipated. He didn't reply. He walked outside, the screen door slamming shut behind him. He sat on the top step, pulling out his pocket knife and a piece of wood, and began to whittle, letting the familiar, mindless motion soothe the turmoil in his mind. He was a man who had fled from the ghosts of a family, and now his house was full of living, breathing reminders of what he had lost, or rather, what he had taken. The irony was a bitter pill. He stared out at the darkening prairie, the sliver of a moon rising in the sky, and felt the walls of his self-imposed prison closing in, tighter than ever before. The next few days passed in a strange, tense truce. Clayton rose before dawn, as he always did, but now the smell of coffee was often accompanied by the aroma of baking bread. Lillian was an early riser, and she moved about the house with a quiet efficiency that was almost ghostly. She and the children were meticulous, leaving no trace of their presence, as if they were trying to be as small and unobtrusive as possible. They ate their meals after he had finished, spoke in hushed tones, and vanished into their rooms or the yard whenever he was in the house. Despite their efforts, their presence was undeniable. A child's forgotten toy on the porch, the faint scent of soap in the air, the sound of a whispered story from the room above his. Each small sign was a crack in the sterile solitude he had cultivated. He found himself watching them from a distance. He saw Thomas, the eldest, splitting kindling with a fierce determination, his small body straining with the effort. He saw Sarah helping her mother hang laundry, her small hands struggling with the clothespins. He saw the twins playing a silent game with pebbles near the creek bed. He saw Lillian, her face a mask of composed resolve, mending a tear in a small shirt, her needle moving with a practiced rhythm that spoke of endless, thankless tasks. He felt a grudging respect for her. She had not complained once. She had not asked for anything beyond the initial shelter. She worked from sunup to sundown, turning his functional house into something that faintly resembled a home. Curtains, patched but clean, appeared on the windows. A jar of wildflowers sat on the long empty dining table. She was nesting, creating a safe space for her young, and Clayton was the unwilling host. His past was a constant companion, a shadow that stretched long in the afternoon sun. 15 years ago, he'd worn a marshal's star. He'd been good at his job, too good, perhaps. Cocky. He and his partner, James Harper, had been closing in on a bank robber, Silas Croft. A chase through the town of Dusty Laramie had ended in a hail of bullets. Clayton had fired, aiming for Croft, but a wagon had lurched into the street at the worst possible moment. His shot went wide. The screams that followed would never leave him. A woman and her child, innocent bystanders, caught in the crossfire. The official inquiry had cleared him. It was a tragedy, an accident in the line of duty. But James Harper, his partner and friend, had lost his sister and his niece that day. James had never blamed him, not with words, but something between them had shattered. The shared laughter, the easy camaraderie. It all vanished, replaced by a chasm of unspoken grief. Clayton couldn't bear the sight of his friend's pain, a pain he had caused. He'd turned in his badge, left Laramie, and bought this ranch with the inheritance he'd never wanted. He'd come here to disappear. He had changed his name from Clayton Miller to Clayton Reeves, severing the last tie to his former life. And for 15 years he had succeeded. Until now. One afternoon, seeking a tool in the bottom of his own dusty trunk, his fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound photograph case. He opened it. It was the only picture he had of that time, a formal portrait taken a month before the shooting. A younger Clayton Reeves, Clayton Miller, stood smiling, his arms slung around the shoulders of his partner, James Harper. They were young, confident, unaware of the tragedy that loomed. He stared at James's face, a face he hadn't allowed himself to picture in years. The guilt was a physical thing, a clawing in his chest. He snapped the case shut and shoved it back under a pile of old clothes, his hands trembling. Later that evening, he saw Lillian sitting on the porch, a small lantern casting a warm glow around her. She held something in her hands. As he drew closer, he saw it was a letter, the paper worn and creased from countless readings. She wasn't reading it, just holding it, her expression one of profound sorrow. He felt like an intruder and was about to retreat when she looked up, her eyes finding his in the gloom. "He was a good man," she said softly, as if continuing a conversation they'd never started. "My husband. He worked for the railroad. A fever took him this past spring. It was fast." Clayton stood awkwardly, unsure what to say. Condolences felt hollow coming from him. "He worried so much about us," she continued, her gaze returning to the letter. "He made me promise I would find a safe place for the children. He said the frontier was a place for new beginnings." Her voice broke on the last word. An idea, cold and sharp, pierced through Clayton's thoughts. Harper. Her name was Harper. His old partner's name was James Harper. It had to be a coincidence. A cruel, gut-wrenching Koinzidenz. The country was vast, but the name was not that common. Still, he clung to the possibility. The man in the photograph was his friend James, who had lost his sister. This woman's husband was a railroad man who died of a fever. They couldn't be the same. He needed to be sure. This correspondence," he began, his voice strained. "The agency in St. Louis. How did you come to contact them?" Lillian folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into its envelope. "It was James's idea. My husband. Before he passed, he made all the arrangements. He said he had an old friend out west, a man who owed him a debt. A man who was lonely and needed a family as much as we needed a home. He said this friend was a good man, despite the ghosts that haunted him. He wrote the first letter to the agency for me. He signed it L. Harper for me. The world stopped spinning. It simply ceased to exist for a moment, leaving Clayton in a silent, airless void. James. His James. The man whose family he had destroyed. That man had sent his own wife and children to him. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a reckoning. The pencil-written note on the letter suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. It was an addition, a clarification that James knew Clayton might miss in his haste. This wasn't a mistake made by a careless bachelor. This was a deliberate, calculated act of a dying man. "His name," Clayton forced the words out, his throat raw. "Your husband's name was James Harper." "Yes," she said, looking at him with a puzzled expression. "Why?" He couldn't answer. He turned and strode away from the house, walking blindly into the darkness of the prairie. He walked until his lungs burned and his legs ached, the pieces of his life rearranging themselves into a picture of horrifying clarity. James hadn't hated him. James had, in his final moments, tried to save him. He had sent Clayton the one thing he thought could heal him, a family. A new family to replace the one he'd taken. It wasn't a punishment. It was a gift, a chance for redemption, delivered to his door in a dusty wagon. And he, in his selfish guilt, had almost turned it away. He sank to his knees in the tall grass, the vast, starry sky pressing down on him, and for the first time in 15 years, Clayton Reeves wept. He returned to the house hours later, a man hollowed out and remade. The lantern on the porch was gone, the house dark and silent. He crept inside and went to his trunk. He retrieved the photograph of him and James and walked softly up the stairs. He paused outside the room where Lillian and the younger children slept. He could hear the soft sound of Emily's breathing. He left the photograph on the small table in the hallway, leaning it against the wall where she would see it in the morning. There were no more secrets to keep. The next morning, an unspoken shift occurred. The tension that had held the house in its grip seemed to dissipate, replaced by a fragile, uncertain peace. When Clayton came into the kitchen, Lillian was standing by the window, the photograph of him and James in her hands. She didn't look at him, but he knew she had been waiting. "You are Clayton Miller," she said. It wasn't a question. "I was," he answered, his voice quiet. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his hand steady for the first time in days. Reeves is my mother's name. I took it when I left Laramie. She placed the photograph gently on the table, next to the wildflower jar. James spoke of you. He said you were the best friend he ever had. He also said you were the most honorable fool he'd ever met. A sad smile touched Clayton's lips. He wasn't wrong. He never blamed you, you know, she said, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were clear, searching his. Not for what happened to his sister. He told me it was a terrible accident, that the blame belonged to the man who started the shooting. He said the guilt was eating you alive, and that it was a greater tragedy than the accident itself. Clayton leaned against the counter, the coffee cup warm in his hands. It felt like my fault. I fired the shot. And Silas Croft robbed the bank and started the gunfight, she countered, her voice gaining strength. James believed in cause and effect, Mr. Reeves. You were an effect. Croft was the cause. James died worrying that you would let that one moment define the rest of your life. They stood in silence, the morning light streaming into the kitchen, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For 15 years, Clayton had carried his guilt as a shield, using it to keep the world at bay. He had believed it was his penance. But James, his wronged friend, had seen it not as justice, but as a waste. This entire scheme, the mail-order bride, the carefully omitted details, the desperate gamble. It was all James's last attempt to free his friend from a prison of his own making. I didn't know, Clayton said, the admission costing him more than he could have imagined. All these years, I thought. I know what you thought, Lillian finished for him. He knew too. That's why he did this. He believed we could save each other. The honesty of her words hung between them, raw and powerful. Save each other. He had been so consumed by his own pain, he hadn't truly considered hers. A widow with 5 children, left with nothing but a desperate plan hatched by her dying husband. Her quiet dignity was not just composure. It was a form of armor, every bit as formidable as his own gruff solitude. From that day on, the house began to change in more fundamental ways. The children, sensing the shift in the emotional atmosphere, grew bolder. The twins' whispers became quiet chuckles. Sarah started asking Clayton questions about the ranch, her curiosity overriding her shyness. Emily would toddle over and hand him a smooth stone or a crumpled flower, her small face serious. Only Thomas remained aloof, his protective gaze constantly on his mother, his suspicion of Clayton slow to fade. Clayton began to teach him. He showed the boy how to mend a fence line, how to read the sky for weather, how to properly groom a horse. He was patient, his instructions direct and practical. He saw the boy's desperation to be the man of the house and understood it. In Thomas's fierce loyalty, Clayton saw a distorted reflection of his own obsessive need to atone. One afternoon, as they worked on a loose hinge on the barn door, Thomas spoke without looking at him. My pa said you were a lawman. I was, Clayton confirmed, holding the hinge steady. A long time ago. Did you catch the man who... the one who started it all? Silas Croft. The question was a sharp jab. No, Clayton said, his voice tight. He got away. Vanished. Is that why you quit? The boy pressed, his eyes narrowed. Because you couldn't catch him? Clayton stopped working and looked at Thomas. He saw not just a boy, but the heir to James's legacy of honor. He owed him the truth. No, son. I quit because I couldn't live with the cost of that day. But maybe I should have stayed. Maybe I should have found him. It was the first time he had admitted that his flight had also been a form of cowardice. He had run from the guilt, but he had also run from the responsibility of seeing justice done. As if summoned by the thought, a rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Not a neighbor or a freight driver. This man rode with a purpose that Clayton recognized instantly. Law. He straightened up, his eyes fixed on the approaching figure. U.S. Marshal. His past, it seemed, was not finished with him yet. As the rider drew closer, another followed, and then a third. Apposse. They reined in their horses a short distance from the barn, their expressions hard, their hands resting near their holsters. The lead marshal, a man with a graying mustache and weary eyes, dismounted. "Clayton Miller?" the marshal asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Clayton felt Thomas stiffen beside him. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I go by Reeves now," he said calmly. "But I'm the man you're looking for." The marshal, whose name was Marcus Whitley, nodded slowly. "We've been tracking Silas Croft. Word is he's been lying low in this territory for years. We got a tip he was seen heading this way. Heard a woman and a passel of kids were traveling with a man matching his description for a time before they got to Cheyenne." Clayton's blood ran cold. Croft, here. And Lillian had unknowingly been in his company. "The woman and children are here," Clayton said, his voice even. "They're under my protection. The man they traveled with left them in Cheyenne. They came the rest of the way with a freight driver." Whitley's eyes were skeptical. "A man quits the service right after a botched shootout, changes his name, and hides out on an isolated ranch for 15 years. Now the very man he was chasing shows up in the same area, and a woman and kids are involved. It looks mighty suspicious, Miller." Before Clayton could respond, Lillian emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She took in the scene, the marshals, their stern faces, Clayton's tense posture, and walked toward them, her chin high. "I am Mrs. Harper," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My children and I are here under the care of Mr. Reeves, an old friend of my late husband. If you have questions about our journey, you may ask me." Whitley turned his attention to her, his expression softening slightly in the face of her composure. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe you were in the company of a fugitive, Silas Croft." "There was a man," Lillian confirmed, her brow furrowing in thought. "He called himself Jones. He shared our fire for a few nights on the trail. He was quiet, kept to himself. He left us before we reached the city." Suddenly, a movement from the corner of his eye caught Clayton's attention. A flicker of motion in the thicket of trees that bordered the creek bed, 100 yards from the house. His old instincts, dormant for so long, flared to life. He knew that patch of land. It offered cover, a view of the house, and an escape route down the creek. It was the perfect place for an ambush or a desperate man to hide. "He's here," Clayton said, his voice low and urgent, not taking his eyes off the trees. "Whitley, he's in the trees by the creek." Whitley and his men drew their weapons, their focus shifting instantly. "How do you know?" "Because that's where I would be," Clayton answered. At that moment a shot rang out, not from the trees, but from the loft of the barn behind the marshals. A fourth man, one Clayton hadn't seen, tumbled from the hayloft, a rifle clattering to the ground beside him. It was Silas Croft. He doubled back. He'd been there the whole time, waiting for his moment. He scrambled to his feet, a wild, cornered look in his eyes, and lunged not for a horse, but for Lillian. Everything slowed down. Clayton saw the glint of the knife in Croft's hand. He saw the terror flash in Lillian's eyes. He saw Thomas start to move, a foolish, brave child ready to throw himself at a killer. Without thinking, Clayton moved. He shoved Thomas behind him and launched himself at Croft, using the momentum to slam them both away from Lillian. They hit the dusty ground in a tangle of limbs. The years of ranch work had kept him strong, but Croft fought with the feral desperation of a trapped animal. The knife flashed, slicing Clayton's arm. He grunted in pain but held on, his mind shockingly clear. The chaos, the fear, the adrenaline, it was all horribly familiar. But this time it was different. This wasn't about a badge or a reputation. It was about the woman and children standing just feet away. It was about James. He saw an opening and drove his fist into Croft's jaw. The man's head snapped back, his grip on the knife loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Clayton wrenched the weapon from his hand and threw it aside. He heard the marshals shouting, the pounding of their boots. He landed another blow, then another, the rage and guilt of 15 years fueling his fists. This was the man, the cause, the source of the nightmare that had derailed his life. A strong hand gripped his shoulder, hauling him back. "That's enough, Miller. He's finished." It was Whitley. Clayton stood, breathing heavily, blood dripping from his arm. Croft lay groaning on the ground, 2 deputies pinning him down. Lillian rushed to his side, her face pale with shock. She tore a strip from her apron and began wrapping his arm, her hands trembling but her touch firm. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her eyes locked on his. He looked past her, at her children huddled on the porch, safe. He looked at the defeated man being bound in ropes. He looked at the marshal watching him with a newfound respect. "I am now," he said, and he meant it. The final ghost had been exorcised, not with a bullet, but with a choice to protect, not to avenge. The cycle was broken. With Silas Croft securely tied to a horse, Marshal Whitley approached Clayton. The other deputies were giving their statements to Lillian, their hats respectfully in their hands. The immediate danger had passed, leaving a strange calm in its wake. "That was some fine work, Miller," Whitley said, his voice stripped of its earlier suspicion. "You never lost it." He gestured toward Clayton's ranch, the mountains standing like silent witnesses behind it. "This is a peaceful life. But you don't belong here. A man with your skills belongs back in the service. I could use a deputy like you. There's a place for you if you want it." The name Miller carries weight again. It was the offer he might have dreamed of years ago, a chance to reclaim his name, his purpose, his honor. But as he looked at Whitley, he felt no pull toward that old life. His gaze drifted to the porch, where Lillian was now kneeling, murmuring reassurances to a tearful Emily. Thomas stood beside her, his fear replaced by an undisguised look of awe directed at Clayton. "I appreciate the offer, Marshal," Clayton said, his voice steady. "But I think I've found my place. My name is Reeves." Whitley held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded in understanding. He saw it all, the woman, the children, the house that was slowly becoming a home. "I understand," he said. "Good luck to you, Reeves." He mounted his horse, gave a final nod, and led his posse, with their prisoner in tow, down the long track away from the ranch. Clayton watched them go until they were just another dust cloud on the horizon. The silence they left behind was different from the one he was used to. It wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken emotions, of relief and a future that was suddenly, terrifyingly, wide open. He turned and walked back to the house. Lillian met him at the steps. She looked at his bandaged arm, then up at his face. All pretenses between them had been burned away in the heat of the confrontation. "James was right," she said softly. "You are an honorable fool." "He was right about a lot of things," Clayton replied. He sat on the top step, the wood warm from the afternoon sun, and patted the space beside him. She hesitated for a moment, then sat down, leaving a respectable distance between them. The children remained on the porch, watching, their silence a testament to the gravity of the moment. "He sent you here to save me from myself, didn't he?" Clayton said, looking out at the valley. "He sent us here because he knew you were a good man who was lost," she corrected gently. "And he knew we were a good family who needed a safe harbor. He trusted you. Even after everything, he trusted you to do the right thing when it mattered most. It took me long enough." The bitterness in his own voice surprised him. "All those wasted years." "Perhaps," she conceded. "But you did it. Today you did it. You protected us. You protected them." She glanced back at her children. "That's all James ever wanted." He finally turned to look at her. He saw the strength that had carried her across a continent, the fierce love for her children, the quiet grief for the husband she'd lost. He saw a partner, not a mail-order bride. He saw a woman of immense character who had been thrust into his life by the last desperate act of a dying friend. "This is your home, Lillian," he said, the words feeling more right than anything he'd said in 15 years. "If you'll have it, you and the children, there's enough work for 2. More than enough room. This was always meant to be a house for a family, Tears welled in her eyes, the first he had ever seen her shed. She didn't try to hide them. She simply let them fall. "We would like that, Clayton," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. "We would like that very much." Months melted into a year. The autumn chill gave way to the deep silence of winter, and then the vibrant rebirth of spring. The Reeves Ranch was transformed. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of children's laughter, the slam of a screen door, the rhythmic creak of the porch swing Clayton had built for Lillian. The empty rooms were filled with life. Thomas was now a capable young man, riding alongside Clayton with a quiet confidence. Sarah's garden bloomed with vegetables and flowers. The twins' energy was endless, and Emily's sunny disposition was the heart of the home. Clayton found a new rhythm to his days. It was no longer just about work and atonement. It was about teaching a boy to be a man, about listening to a little girl's stories, about sharing a quiet cup of coffee with a woman on the porch as the sun came up. He learned the names of Sarah's dolls and the twins' favorite hiding spots. He learned that Lillian hummed when she baked and that she had a smile that could light up the entire kitchen. His love for her grew as quietly and steadily as the crops in the field. It was a love born not of passion and romance, but of shared hardship, mutual respect, and the profound comfort of belonging. It was a pragmatic love, built on the foundation of a found family, and it was stronger than any he could have imagined. One cool evening in late summer, they sat together on the porch, watching the children chase fireflies in the twilight. The day's work was done. A comfortable silence settled between them. "I received a letter from the agency in St. Louis," Lillian said, breaking the quiet. "They were writing to confirm that the arrangement was satisfactory." She paused, a small smile playing on her lips. "They seem to think I'm your mail-order bride." Clayton looked at her, at the way the fading light caught in her hair. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "The arrangement is more than satisfactory," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "It's not what I planned. It's better." She squeezed his hand, her eyes shining in the dusk. "Yes," she agreed, "much better." He had sent for a wife to cure his loneliness. He had received a widow and 5 children who had, instead, healed his soul. James Harper's final, desperate gamble had paid off. Redemption hadn't come from a marshal's badge or a forgotten past. It had come in the form of 5 small pairs of shoes by the door, a woman's steady presence by his side, and the realization that the family he had inadvertently helped to shatter had, in the end, given him a new one to build. The ghosts of the past were finally quiet, replaced by the vibrant, hopeful sounds of a home filled with love. The story of Clayton and Lillian is a reminder that sometimes, the greatest gifts in life are the ones we never asked for. Their journey from mistaken identity to a deep, abiding love shows that families can be forged in the most unexpected ways. What do you think is the most important element in building a family? Blood, choice, or circumstance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.